I stand before you to address a systematic campaign of disinformation, hate speech, and anti-Indigenous rhetoric that has been propagated by many of the media outlets, including Noticias, Protagonistas, and Noticias, Fides. What you have witnessed is not journalism, but a calculated assault on indigenous Hindu communities worldwide. Let me address these false allegations directly, one by one. First, about KAILASA being a fictitious nation. I would like to know, by what authority do you claim the power to recognize or derecognize nations? Even UN does not have such authority. The Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of States 1933 states that a legitimate nation must have permanent population, defined territory, a self-sustained government, and capacity for international relationships. And KAILASA fulfills all these criteria with enough and more evidence required. The Montevideo Convention explicitly states that the political existence of a state is independent of recognition by other states. And Article 13 of the Charter of Organization of American States further reinforces on this principle. So your characterization of KAILASA's fictional nation is a strong statement against the Hindu diaspora worldwide. This is not journalism, this is incitement to violence against the Hindu communities. Coming to the next allegation about fraudulent land acquisition. Let us be absolutely clear that these agreements are in question are between a US-based Hindu organization and the indigenous Bolivian communities. These are conservation partnerships that are explicitly to respect the indigenous ownership and sovereignty, not land acquisitions in any sense. And the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is not a signatory in these agreements. So your deliberate misattribution reveals your intention to attack the Hindu leadership specifically. These agreements include support for environmental protection, preservation of indigenous knowledge, humanitarian aid, and cultural exchange, all fully compliant with Bolivian Law Number 465 and the ILO Convention 169. Next, about the allegation of financial exploitation. Regarding the economic components were not the payments for the land, but they were investments in the community development, cultural preservation, and even these resources are managed by the communities themselves. The indigenous communities exercise their constitutional right to self-determination and determine the appropriate value of these conservation partnerships. Your suggestion that indigenous leaders cannot determine fair value is deeply patronizing and denies their agency. While you fixate on consensual financial arrangements, you completely ignore the massive exploitation of indigenous lands by extractive industries. Why you are doing the selective outrage? Coming to the next point of violation of indigenous sovereignty of these partnerships. These partnerships explicitly honor the indigenous sovereignty with all agreements and recognize the indigenous autonomy and decision-making processes. The Article 30, Section 2, Clause 4 of the Bolivian Constitution explicitly guarantees the indigenous peoples the right to self-determination and territoriality. The indigenous communities exercise precisely this constitutional right. The real violation of this indigenous sovereignty is your paternalistic suggestion that indigenous communities need protection from forming partnerships of their choosing. This colonial mindset treats indigenous peoples as incapable of making informed decisions. Again, the next point regarding the credibility of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has faced many personal attacks against him, and he is not a self-proclaimed guru or a self-styled godman. His lineage traces back through ancient Hindu spiritual institutions, forming recognition from traditional authorities. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has been completely exonerated by multiple courts worldwide. Complete judicial exoneration by Gujarat High Court, the US Court vindication with nearly $500,000 awarded for the defamation, the Karnataka High Court protection declaring the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism's arrest as illegal and without jurisdiction. We have solid medical evidences demonstrating the biological impossibility of these false allegations. And finally, the Interpol's refusal to issue notices, recognizing the political nature of this persecution. Your continued promotion of these false allegations, explicitly rejected by courts worldwide, demonstrate this is not journalism but targeted religious persecution. Next point being about the alleged rejection by the indigenous communities. This claim is completely false and designed to drive a colonial wedge between the indigenous communities worldwide. There is no legitimate indigenous communities have spoken against these partnerships. These supposed rejections are either completely fabricated or represent small factions, not representative of wider communities. You provide no evidence of any actual community-wide rejections through proper indigenous assemblies, democratic votes, or traditional consensus processes, because none exist. This is just a classic divide and conquer tactic, falsely claiming that indigenous peoples reject their partnerships that actually benefit them. Next point about political controversy. What we maliciously frame as controversy is a standard diplomatic protocol followed by a representative of all nations. Meeting with government officials is precisely how the international relations function. You imply impropriety in absolutely normal diplomatic activities you will never even question from Western organizations. This double standard reveals your colonial mindset that indigenous nations should not engage in international diplomacy, and the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is not involved in any of these diplomatic initiatives. Your deliberate conflation reveals your intent to persecute him specifically. Regarding your allegations about environmental exploitation, these partnerships are explicitly designed for environmental protection, not exploitation. They focus on preserving biodiversity, maintaining forest integrity, supporting sustainable indigenous management practices. All agreements include provisions for ecological conservation based on both traditional indigenous knowledge and the modern sustainable practices. While you manufacture false concerns about conservation partnerships, you remain conspicuously silent about the actual exploitation of these indigenous lands by mining companies, oil drilling operations, and many more. Coming to the next point about the pattern of similar activities. Yes, Hindu organizations engage with indigenous communities worldwide. This is not a pattern of fraud, but a systematic commitment to global indigenous solidarity. These engagements include humanitarian aid, cultural exchange programs, environmental conservation initiatives, and diplomatic relationship building. All standard international activities you would never question from the Western organizations. You mischaracterize legitimate diplomatic and humanitarian engagement as fraud without providing any evidence of actual illegality or harm. Regarding the allegations about the false representation at the UN, the Hindu indigenous representatives have legitimately participated in various UN forums following the established protocols for civil society and indigenous representation. The United Nations has published over 21 reports documenting the persecution faced by KAILASA and the indigenous Hindu communities worldwide. You deliberately mischaracterize legitimate UN forum participation as sneaking in language you would never ever apply to the Western NGOs or any other religious groups participating in the identical process. Your claim that India informed the United Nations and the recognition was withdrawn is a complete false news. No such event has ever occurred or been recorded. On the allegations of unauthorized presence in the indigenous territories, all the visits within the indigenous territories occur with explicit invitation and authorization from legitimate indigenous authorities exercising their constitutional right to welcome the guests onto their sovereign lands. The Article 30, Section 2, Clause 4 of the Bolivian Constitution explicitly guarantees the indigenous people the right to self-determination and territoriality, which includes determining who may enter their territories. You provide no evidence of any unauthorized presence. Your allegation is relying entirely on the colonial assumption that indigenous communities cannot make these decisions independently. On the allegations of immigration violations, all Hindu representatives traveling internationally fully comply with the relevant immigration laws and the visa requirements. They enter countries legally, maintain the appropriate visa status, and depart in accordance with the regulations. And the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is not involved in any of these diplomatic initiatives. These are independent actions by representatives with proper immigration status. You provide no evidence of any immigration violations, no documentation, no government statements, no legal proceedings, because none of these even exist. What we are witnessing here is not journalism, but a weaponized media serving as the enforcement arm of anti-indigenous interests. Your systematic distortions, fabrications, and deliberate omissions follow the exact historical pattern that has preceded violence against the religious minorities throughout the history. We stand today at a critical historical moment where anti-indigenous colonial media has launched an unprecedented campaign of hate speech and persecution against indigenous Hindu communities worldwide. We will not be silenced. We will not allow the anti-indigenous media to erase our existence or deny our fundamental rights to self-determination and international engagement. The world is watching, the history is recording, and the truth will prevail.